All right. Hey, class. So, what I want to talk about right now for Unit 1 is I want to talk about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a pretty, well, very important period in the development of Western culture. And we really need to look at the roots. There's going to be a ton of stuff that's based off of or impacted by the Enlightenment as we move forward. And so I know this is the first unit, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background. How did we get to where the Enlightenment was a critical phase and a critical component? And we'll get there. But uh, right now, I want to try to give you an all encompassing view of the Enlightenment. And I think that by doing this, when you embark in Unit 1, you're going to be able to understand why Hobbes was important and why all of the philosophies that were coming out about self rule were so critical, why satire and the ability to critique our rulers and the freedom of press and all the things that today, baked right into the American Constitution, we hold to be so critically important were formulated during this time period. And I want to, as one of the goals in this course, is to constantly connect who we are today to who we were. And when I say we, I mean it in the most broad sense, to who, as Western culture, we were before. And as I've mentioned before, there's lots of other cultural influences that matter. This particular course, we look more concretely at Western culture. And so when I say, Western culture, I'm really talking about everything that happened in the Western half of the world during this time period. So what's the time period we're looking at? We're looking at, let's just say we're starting roughly in the early 1600s. You could argue, and people do argue, that the Enlightenment really started before that, and that's totally fine. We're not too concerned about prescribed dates for this particular course. We're looking at general trends and motivations that move through time. So let's talk about the Enlightenment. Pretty fun, pretty raucous period. There's a lot happening here. So let's take a step back and look at just what happened before. So if you happen to take the first portion of this class, Intro to Humanities 1, we would have talked about Egypt and Greece and lots of things. But some of the early things, in Greece, we get the first illustration of democracy. And so democracy is this, obviously very important idea that's about the people and the rule of the people. And I know that's we have to put some footnotes in there. It's for ruling men only. It's not the most egalitarian system, but it is a pretty revolutionary system, even in Greece, where you have a voting body of people who dictate the outcome of their society, at least at the city-state level. And then we move to Rome, and we know that Rome had a long, long history and potent influence over the world, and more of a republic. But both of these concepts are instrumental to who we are today. And so when we look at Greece and Rome, and we look at ancient history, it wasn't this perfect period of idealistic situations. It was fraught with turmoil. But these ideas of democracy and republics came out of these civilizations. And unfortunately, around 500 AD, for a variety of reasons, which you need to take the whole first course to understand, but the world fell apart. And we went into what is known as, pejoratively, the Dark Ages. I like the term the Dark Ages. It's dramatic, but more realistically, it's called the medieval period. But let's talk about what happened. So Rome controlled most of the Mediterranean world, and it was terribly successful. And it controlled North Africa. It controlled portions of the Middle East up into portions of Turkey, and then swept across the northern Mediterranean, and then all the way up into Europe and all the way up into what we know as modern day Britain and England. And so during that time period, Rome had a dominance, a cultural dominance over that whole region. But Rome fell. And a lot of the minds of Rome would head to Constantinople, and we'd see the birth of the Eastern Church. And Rome would literally be in ruins and tatters all the way until, you could argue, the 1300s, when we come across what we now refer to as the Renaissance. And during that period, life wasn't good. People were hiding out in castles. Literacy rates plummeted. In many cases, population centers basically disbanded. The Dark Ages is referred to as the Dark Ages because learning and knowledge in architecture and engineering and mathematics, specifically in Europe, took a total nosedive. They went way down in ability for almost 1,000 years. And this is where we get a lot of our feudal tales, and we get kings and queens and primogeniture, meaning we pass rule on to the son of the current ruler. There's violent overthrows of power, there's wars. And so what did people build during that time? Well, let's take a step back. You can always judge a civilization, and it's kind of a cursory judge, but can be important, based on their architectural feats. So we're going to be looking at architecture a lot over the course of this semester. And architecture matters a ton. What can people build? That matters. And so when you look at Greece and Rome, they built all sorts of things. The Parthenon, and in Rome, they had the Colosseum, and they had these giant temples in Greece to their gods and goddesses. In Rome, they built this fantastic system of roads. They were very architecturally and mathematically complex for their time and era. By the time we get to the medieval period, they are really proud when they can build a castle. And why do you build a castle? Because you want to keep out all the other hordes. And there were lots of hordes of poor, hungry, roaming bands of people. And so I really like to compare, and this isn't completely fair, but during the medieval or the Dark Ages, it's like the rulership is a bunch of bikers. They're a bunch of people who ride around on horses and they beat people up. And there's, at the end of this period, by 1000, they're going to start building cathedrals, and there's going to be all sorts of fantastic advancements. But to put it in a nutshell, the Dark Ages, the medieval period for Western culture, is a really rough time. It's a really tumultuous time filled with turmoil. So where do we get enlightenment as a term? Well, it means to enlighten. And what are you enlightening when we talk about the Enlightenment? The Dark Ages. So what are we going to see? Literacy rates improve. Mathematical ability cross-culturally improves. Across Western cultures is going to be on the rise. And during this whole time period, obviously, this is all interfused, both the Enlightenment and the Dark Ages and the medieval period, across Europe and the Mediterranean, with Islam and Christianity. And both of those are going to feed in. They're going to compete. They're going to coalesce. They're going to work together. There's going to be lots of different iterations of how Islam and Christianity impact this period. But we need to see the light. And what does that mean to the Dark Ages? So let's talk about that a little bit. So, impacts of the Enlightenment. One of the terms that's going to become kind of a late Enlightenment term, but I think it sums it up well, and it really helps us understand kind of our American history, is deism and this clockmaker idea. And so the founding fathers of the United States were deists, and they were out and out deists. And they even self-labeled sometimes as deists. And they very much believed in a Christian God. But they started to put limits on the Christian God. And so they saw the world as a clock. And this is a, sorry, terrible clock, but 1, 3, 6, or sorry, 12, 3, 6, and 9. And it was a very, very complex, wound up grandfather clock with all sorts of gears in here that would turn around and lots of complex parts. Because during this time period, a clock was about the most complex mechanism that humans had built. And so they viewed the world, the entire world, as this clock. And they said, God doesn't dabble in everyday things. He's a clockmaker, and he built this clock, and he wound the clock up, and he made all the rules, so to speak, for the universe. And then he steps back after having wound the clock, and he watches the interworkings of a clock. And so you might ask, okay, so where did this idea come from? Well, divine right during the Enlightenment started to get challenged. So you ask, what is divine right? Well, divine right is what dictated how rulers were chosen. And so if we go to the very top of any hierarchical scale, God is at the top, and this is in a feudal system. And then below God, we have a king. And then below the king, we have a small ruling class of dukes and barons and nobles. So we'll call them the ruling class. And then below them, we have everyone else. Except, however, up here, we have the church. And the church kind of interacts on this whole level. And basically, during the feudal period, when we had kings, why was the king the king? Well, the king was the king because God chose the king. And if you study the medieval period, it's full of kings who did very questionable things. Some great kings, but also many kings who did some very, very questionable things. And so what starts to happen is everyone, the masses down here, start to say, hey, why is this person the king? And the king's like, well, because God chose me. And I sort of am like the word of God. Whatever I say, because I'm the ruler, is what it is. And everybody down here said, that seems questionable. And so when deism came about, and this is what's going to cause democracy to be born, this is going to cause the American Revolution, this exact idea. The American Revolution down here is going to be a byproduct of this. And so as the deists started to gain a little bit more influence, they said, yeah, God made all the rules, but God didn't choose all of you, and including the ruling class, to be in charge. No, that did not happen, according to everybody during this time period. And so they started following this deist clockmaker that God built the clock, built the world, but he didn't dictate exactly what was supposed to happen, just the rules of the system. And so I asked this question, what causes the universe to tick? And during this time period, because of this deist worldview, cause and effect. So if I go out and I study science and I study gravity or I study mathematics, I study cause and effect, something that I can see repeated over time. Every time I test it, the same outcome occurs. We have a cause and effect universe rather than a God tinkering universe. It's a God rule setting universe. And so this is going to be one of the things that fuels or spurns the scientific revolution. And this belief that cause and effect is championed. And so if we have a cause and effect or a clockmaker universe, it begs the question, Who controls the people and why do they control the people? If God didn't dictate every single outcome, but just set up this system of rules, why is the king the king? And they said, you know what? We don't want the king to be the king. We want to choose our own ruler. And so this notion of divine right starts to become challenged. And it's going to be hundreds of years that this is challenged. Much of this course that we're looking at is about the challenging of the divine right. And you're going to see that starting to come out in these first chapters. Even when you read The Modest Proposal, The Modest Proposal is going to be a small chunk of challenging that. But what are the people of Ireland going to say? Why do these British ruling class people get to take all of our money and all of our hard work in this feudal system and send it from Ireland to England? Why do they get to do that? And eventually, people like Jonathan Swift are going to say they shouldn't. And so he's going to write satirical prose in the form of The Modest Proposal, where he advocates, I'm not going to give you any spoilers here, but he advocates some pretty egregious or sensitive topics about children and the nature of work and the nature of value within a society. And so we see here in England the idea of the rights of man starting to come up and the rebirth, again, democracy or Renaissance here. This idea of Renaissance, the term is rebirth, but we are going to see a rebirth of those Greek and Roman ideals of democracy and self-rule starting to come back. This is the Enlightenment. All right, so let's talk about some of the impacts of the Enlightenment and what this means. So, what caused the Enlightenment? Well, we have the Renaissance. So, the Renaissance, as I said, starts around 1300. Well, what ends up happening is over in Constantinople, which if you look at the Mediterranean, this is going to be a very crude drawing. The Mediterranean, we have Egypt and the pyramids here. Oh, I better draw the boot of Italy coming down. We've got Italy coming down into the Mediterranean. And over here on the edge of Turkey, we have Constantinople. Over here, obviously, well, right about there, we have Rome. Well, when the Dark Ages fell, a lot of people left Rome, the wealthy people, the people with books and all of that Roman, Greek and Roman knowledge. They fled to Constantinople. But then eventually, the Muslims were going to come back up and sack Constantinople, pushing a lot of these people out. Now, this was going to take 1,000 years, but these people were going to flood back to Italy. At the same time, in Italy, where the Renaissance was going to really take foot, they were starting to read ancient Greek and Roman texts. And they said, wow, these folks had some pretty interesting information. And so what did they do? They started reading these books and they're like, oh my gosh, like look at all these different forms of government that we have. Look at all these different ideas. And as this is happening, people from Constantinople are heading back to Rome with this knowledge from Rome in these books. It's called brain drain. And that's going to be one of the pieces that fuels the Renaissance. Now, at the same time, that's not the only piece. You're going to have major technological advancements in shipping and trade. You're going to have modern banking pop up, all sorts of things that fuel a successful middle class, small middle class, but growing middle class in Italy. And so as this starts to happen, all sorts of scientific breakthroughs are going to occur because of this new way of seeing the world building upon these old books from ancient Rome and Greece. They're coming back into Europe. And so as we start to see this, one of the things that spins off, not the only by any means, but one of the things is the printing press. And so for those of you who've had a chance to study the history of the printing press, it's wild. We take a period where most of Europe is illiterate. most of Europe um, is Christian, but can't even read the Bible. The Bible is in Latin, which is a language that most people can't even speak, let alone read. And all of a sudden, we have the printing of all sorts of text, but specifically the Bible, in vernacular languages, meaning the languages that people speak. And what is that going to create? That is going to fuel a whole slew of things. Now, the printing press didn't only lead to the Bible, it also led to protest documents or pamphlets where people were able to read these pamphlets and start having new concepts and new ideas. And this was going to lead to a whole revolution. And out of this revolution, again, this would take hundreds of years. And this is what we're talking about. When Swift or Voltaire or some of these guys that we're going to be reading about in the textbook, when they start challenging the traditional ruling class, the kings of their era, when they start challenging that ruling class, what is the ruling class going to do? They're going to try to control their speech. They're going to try to control their press, printing press, free press. They're going to try to control that. And so, what are these new political thinkers coming out of the Enlightenment debate? They debate, who should our rulers be? Why should they be our rulers? What do we need to protect in order to protect the rights of the individual? And so, obviously, the First Amendment, free speech, free press, and freedom of religion are going to be cornerstone ideals for this notion of a free people who are throwing off the ruling class. And this is just going to be the first step in the Enlightenment. At the same time, we have, which I don't have on this slide, which I should, but we have the march of science and knowledge, meaning that we continue to study why things happened and we continue to determine their causality. And all of these things together are going to lead to our modern world. They're going to lead to the birth of democracy or the rebirth of democracy. They're going to lead to the scientific revolution, which is going to lead to the industrial revolution, and lots of new things constantly speeding up the pace of our world. So that's the Enlightenment in a nutshell. I hope that helps you with this week's unit. Make sure you pay attention to all the details in this week's unit. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.